Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. And this is our weekly webinar on what's new in SQL Server 2012. This is actually a 13-part series for those of you who are joining for the first time. We've been covering the new features in SQL Server 2012 over a 13-week period. And this particular week, we are actually going to take a look in detail at the new analysis services tabular model. This is a new feature in SQL Server 2012, has gotten quite a bit of attention, and we're going to go through some of the details and the specifics and look at an example of what the tabular model offers and how we can use it. Well, my name is Kevin Goff. I'm a SQL Server MVP, and I also train and work for a company called SetFocus. We are actually a Microsoft certified partner for learning solutions, and I'm both a trainer in SQL Server and a business intelligence practice manager there. So let's go through the introductions here and get into the demos pretty quickly. Again, this is a 13-part series of the new features in SQL Server 2012. I'm very much a believer in presentations that get right in the specifics and get right into the facts. So the old just the facts approach to learning, in this case, the new capabilities in SQL Server 2012. Well, just a very, very quick bio on me. Again, my name is Kevin Goff. I'm a SQL Server MVP. I train for a company called SetFocus. You can get these slides out on my website. My website is www.kevinsgoff.net. This is actually the only thing you need to write down, is www.kevinsgoff.net. The slide deck, actually for this week as well as for prior weeks, is actually out on that site. In a few minutes, I'll go over to the site and just show you the special web page I have that's dedicated to this 13-part series. But that's the only thing that you need to write down here, is just kevinsgoff.net. Now, as I said, I train for a company called SetFocus. We offer training in .NET, SQL Server, Business Intelligence, and SharePoint. If you are interested in training, more full-blown training, you go to our site, setfocus.com. We also have a free training portal with about 100 hours of free training that's been lifted from existing curriculum, and that's in a website called freetraining.setfocus.com. So again, you can just go to my site and you can pull down the slide deck, and it has all the other address information. So the only thing on here that's critical is just my website, kevinsgoff.net. Okay, well, moving forward here, this is week 7 in our 13-week series. We spent the first almost month and a half looking at the enhancements over on the relational database engine by looking at the new column store index, the new T-SQL capabilities, the new features and integration services. Last week we looked at an overview of the business intelligence semantic model, which is the new model that sort of sits on top of analysis services. And both today and next week, we're going to look at the new tabular model. This is another way to create analytic databases without necessarily having to go through the full-blown learning curve of OLAP. Now, this is still large enough of a feature that we're going to spend 2 weeks looking at it. So today is going to be part 1 of the specifics of the tabular model, and then next week is going to be part 2. We're going to build 2 different demos over the course of these 2 weeks. Today I'm going to build a fairly simple but still relatively important demo. I'm going to throw a few intermediate features in. And then next week I'm going to look at a more advanced example of a tabular model with analysis services. So that's what we've got on the schedule for the next 2 weeks. Then obviously you can read the slide deck to see the schedule the rest of the way, where we look at things like Power Pivot and the DAX programming language that we use with the tabular model, and then things like integration with SharePoint. So those will be coming in subsequent weeks. But this week and next week, going to focus on the new tabular model. Now I'm going to get over into SQL Server and into SQL Server Data Tools in just a minute. I'm going to stay there throughout much of the hour, but a little bit of introduction. I talked about some of this last week. The new tabular model is a new methodology for creating analytic databases using SQL Server 2012. It's an alternative to OLAP. If you have tried to build OLAP cubes and the functionality and the learning curve seems a little bit daunting, Well, you might have an interest in taking a look at the tabular model. It doesn't offer every last feature that you see in OLAP, although it certainly offers a number of them. And depending upon your requirements, might fit just right for your learning curve and for the requirements of your company to build an analytic database. And so we're going to build an analytic model here using the tabular model today. Now, one thing about the installation of SQL Server, if you have installed SQL Server and you want to utilize this tabular model, you actually have to install a separate instance. For example, anybody who has built OLAP databases on their local machine might have just installed one instance of SQL Server, and they might have just simply had the default name of localhost. And they might have used that both for the relational database engine as well as for analysis services. Well, if we want to use the tabular model, you do have to go back through the installation and set up a separate instance specifically for the tabular model. I actually have that on my machine right now. I'll show that in just a little while when I get into the product. So I have an instance for the relational database engine, and I also have an instance for the tabular model. Well, in a minute, I'm going to be going into what used to be called BIDS, but is now called SQL Server Data Tools. It still has the general BIDS operational look and feel, although it's been updated to be in line with Visual Studio 2010. So there's now no longer a need to have BIDS 2008 on a machine. This is now in line with Visual Studio 2010. You get the 2010 interface, and they've changed the name from BIDS to SQL Server Data Tools. But it still feels and works almost identically to what you had with BIDS. Now we're going to retrieve data from a relational data source, but there's only so many different demos that we can run. But the point to remember is that the SQL Server Data Tools interface that we can use to create a tabular model can import from multiple sources. It could be from spreadsheets, it could be from CSV files, it could even be from another analytic database. We're going to pull data from sort of a mini data mart that's in a relational database in SQL Server, but the point is that you can build a tabular model from many different sources. Now, the developer can use SQL Server Data Tools to create a tabular model that has different data relationships, some calculations, some KPIs, some hierarchies, some perspectives. Perspectives are a filtered-down version of the database to appeal to people who might only need to see a few dimensions and a few fact tables. We can build partitions, and we can implement row-based security. Now, we're going to look at some of these features this week. We're not going to look at all of them. Some of them are going to spill over into the next week. Now, a developer can deploy, once they create a tabular model project in SQL Server Data Tools, in the same way that they would create an OLAP project using BIDS before, you can deploy one of two ways. The default way is an in-memory database that uses the XVelocity engine that was formerly known as Vertipack. The name is now XVelocity. So this is an in-memory column store database that's utilizing the XVelocity engine that I demonstrated when I talked about the column store index several weeks ago. Well, that's optimized, it's compressed. It can throw a very, very large database into memory, and the ultimate queries that fire are going to go against the in-memory database. That's the default. There's another mode that we're going to look at next week called direct query. If you're familiar with OLAP at all, it's similar to relational OLAP, where the tabular model is just a definition, contains no data. And the analysis services engine sends T-SQL queries the underlying source. Maybe we're in a scenario where it's not practical to have an in-memory database. Or maybe our underlying data changes so quickly that we need to, anytime someone wants data from a tabular model, the query needs to be passed back to the relational source because data is changing so quickly. We'll look at how to set that up next week. We'll look at that next week. Now, once this tabular model has been deployed, so we have to deploy the tabular model just in the same way that you deploy SSIS packages or SSRS reports. We deploy them to a server. End users or power users or developers can access this tabular model through some of the same tools that you could use to access OLAP databases. Things like Excel, reporting services, and as we're ultimately going to see the new reporting services visualization tool in SharePoint called Power View that we'll look at about a month or so from now. Now, some people ask the question, can the tabular model handle the same size databases that we would see with OLAP? Well, can't answer every last scenario, but certainly in a number of scenarios the answer to that is yes. Tabular model databases can be used for large databases. Now, again, depending upon the amount of server memory that you want to devote to something like this, you might not necessarily want to use the XVelocity engine. You might simply want to implement direct query mode, but this can be used for databases beyond what you would normally see as the limitation for something like Power Pivot, where you've got a default limit of 2 gigabytes. This can go well beyond 2 gigabytes in size. Well, the demo that we're going to look at today, again, we're going to build a relatively simple demo today, and next week we're going to build a more complicated model. By the time we're all done, we will have built a couple of projects. The one that we're going to do today is going to use AdventureWorks as the data source. Most people are familiar with AdventureWorks, so I wanted to start with a database that everybody can relate to. And the next week, going to use a different data source where we're going to extend some of the capabilities of the tabular model. Well, along the way, we're going to look at building relationships between fact and dimension data. We're going to look at defining some measures and defining some roll-ups, defining some hierarchies for parent-child relationships to maybe navigate a geography hierarchy or a product hierarchy. We're going to look at hiding the columns that a user doesn't need. Maybe we have surrogate keys that we need for joining the data together in a model, but don't necessarily need to show to an end user. Going to build a KPI. Going to look at building some perspectives. Going to look at building some partitions. Now, next week we're going to look at we're going to start looking at DAX. I'm intentionally keeping DAX out of the picture this week. I want to focus on some of the other capabilities of the tabular model, and then next week we're going to start looking a little bit at DAX, and then the following set of weeks we're going to look at DAX more in detail. So we'll get started here. I'm going to share my desktop. Give this a second to transition. And I'm going to come over to SQL Server Management Studio. And in SQL Server Management Studio, we're going to look at a database that's called AdventureWorks DW 2012. Now, this is a demo database that you can pull down from Codeplex, obviously free of charge. And this has it's a good demo database that has customers, products, orders, salesmen, reseller data, sales quotas. It's very good database for demoing some of the basic capabilities of, in this case, the tabular model. Now, I'm not going to focus on all the tables. If you're familiar with the AdventureWorks analytic project that comes with AdventureWorks, I'm not going to rebuild that from scratch. I'm simply going to take some selected tables from it. Now, I want to stress that you can build a tabular model from a variety of sources. I'm choosing to use a relational data source, one that's sort of half normalized, half denormalized as the first example. Next week we'll look at a different example. Now, the tables that we're going to pull from, I actually have a list of the tables that we're going to pull from here. If you're familiar with the AdventureWorks tables at all, I'm going to bring in the customer master, and we're going to build a view off of it. I'm going to call that view dim customer. I'll explain in a minute why we're going to implement some views. Well, AdventureWorks also has a date calendar called dim date that has a date range of a couple of years with the definition of the corresponding week and month and quarter and so forth. Got an employee dimension of salespeople. I've got a geography dimension that, kind of self-explanatory, has some geography definitions for city and state and country, and a reseller dimension. Now, the resellers are basically vendors. Now, there are going to be two main fact tables of summarized sales. There's fact internet sales and there's fact reseller sales. Now, the fact internet sales is a sales channel that's, I'm going to avoid too much typing in here, but it's basically by by customer, by date, and by product for this example. The reseller sales summary table has similar measures. It has measures for sales amount and for cost and tax and freight, but this one is by reseller. It's by date. It's by employee and by product. So the granularity here of the reseller sales summary has some dimensions that overlap, the date dimension and the product dimension, but the internet sales is actually by customer, and the reseller sales is by reseller or vendor. Now, as it turns out, both of these, the customer and the reseller, are tied to geography. So we actually have an indirect relationship involving customer and reseller here. Now, we're going to have to set up these relationships in the tabular model. Well, ultimately, what we want to do is we want to do things like look at sales both on the internet channel and the reseller channel by some of the common dimensions, by date, by product, and by the one indirect dimension that's tied to both of them by geography. So one of the things we might want to do is look at both internet sales and reseller sales by product, by date, and by geography. So that's one goal. And when we say look at it by product, within this product dimension, there could be, and I actually forgot to do product here. So we have VDIM product as well. Need to have that one. Well, the product dimension has attributes like category, subcategory, product color, product size. So when we say we want to look at sales by product, it could be by any related attribute of the product dimension, the date dimension, or the geography dimension. So that's one goal, is to look at sales side by side. Well, we also have a quota table. Well, the quota is actually, as it turns out, by employee and by quarter. Well, we're going to want to look at reseller sales versus quota and do it by employee and by quarter. Now, we're going to set up a KPI to visually depict the performance of a salesperson with respect to their quota. So if somebody is at or above their quota, then we'll have a visualization, maybe a green check mark that indicates that that person is in a good status. And if somebody is way below their quota by a percent, maybe they're only at 70% of their quota, we'll show something like a red stoplight or some other visualization that indicates something negative. So we'll actually set up a key performance indicator. So those are some of the things that we're going to do with this data. Now, we're going to have intentionally a little surprise along the way. Now, I know that it's not a surprise, but we're going to pretend like it's going to be a surprise. As it turns out, because this sales quota data is by quarter, we're going to have to add a little mini dimension along the way. So we're going to build a model initially off of this set of tables and realize after the fact that we're going to need one more. Well, that's obviously a common thing in real life, is to build a model and realize, oops, there's some relationship that we didn't fully account for. So, how do we go back and add this in without necessarily having to start over? How can we fit this in? Well, back in Management Studio, I've got views for all of these tables. Now, what I've done here is I've taken some of the existing data in AdventureWorks. For instance, in AdventureWorks, there's a DIM customer. Now, I don't necessarily want all the columns from DIM customer. I only want some of them. Now, this could have been done in a number of ways. We could have had another ETL process that could have read just the columns we wanted. Or in the tabular model, I could point to DIM customer and then just select just the columns I want. Or back in the relational source, we can have a view set up. You can walk into 10 different companies and see it done a couple of different ways. Certainly a popular way in a lot of environments, because the people who might be building tabular models, they could be developers. They, in some cases, if you're using Power Pivot, could be power users. Well, we're going to make it easy for them by creating views ahead of time. So I've built views that are taking a subset of the columns. So for DIM customer, I'm taking a subset of the columns. For most of the the underlying tables, I'm just simply taking a subset of the columns. Dim date is a little bit different. I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. Dim employee, I'm grabbing just a subset of the columns, and I'm also grabbing the maximum start date within that table, since the dim employee table is actually set up as a slowly changing dimension where there are multiple records for each person with different start dates. Well, I'm going to collapse this down into just one row per person. Then we got a geography dimension that is just simply the geography, key, the city, the state, and so forth. The product dimension. Now what I've done here, because the AdventureWorks data warehouse actually normalizes the product dimension, well, in my view here, I'm denormalizing it. I'm joining dim product to dim product subcategory to dim product category. I'm creating one flat dimension with the category, subcategory, and product name as one table, as one view. Dim reseller, I'm simply just pulling in a few columns. And then for the fact tables, because the fact tables are down at the transaction number level, and because maybe in the tabular analytic model, not looking to drill down to individual transactions, we want to roll up things to product category and year and quarter and things like that. I've intentionally left out the underlying sales order number, and I'm rolling this up by product, by order date, and by customer key. And for the reseller sales summary table, I'm rolling it up by product key, order date key, reseller key, and employee key, and I'm summing all of the individual columns for cost and sales amount. Now again, I'm going to build a tabular model off of these views. Now I'm going to stress again, once we get into the tabular model, that we could create a tabular model from many different sources. And then coming back up here, the quota table is simply going to bring forward the employee key, the quarter key, which is the combination of the calendar year and the quarter, by employee, and pulling forward the sales quota amount. Now, I mentioned I was going to skip dim date for a minute and come back here. Now you could, as you probably know, if you built data warehouses before, if you've been exposed to data warehouses, you can talk to many different people, get many different views about how a date dimension should be constructed. Well, what I've done here, I probably have gone a little bit overboard as far as making it easy for somebody building the tabular model, but what I've done here is I've taken the underlying date dimension and I've constructed a lot of columns that I might want to use for analytics, like weekend date, month description, quarter key, and so forth. I'm going to take a look at specifically what this looks like. I've run this view ahead of time, so let me take a look at it. Let's say select star from vdim date to take a look at what's in here. Well, vdim date has every date, the display of the date, and then I'm calculating a weekend date. I'll get to the calculation in a minute. So I'm calculating whatever is the Saturday date. Well, I've also got a month description and a month key, along with a quarter description and a quarter key. Now, if you're wondering why both, well, if you've ever done any analytic reporting where you show data chronologically, we might want to display the quarter, but we certainly don't want to sort on it. And some interface tools might sort on this by default. Well, that becomes even more of a problem if you take a look at a month. If you sort it on the month by the description, you get April and August at the top of the list, and that obviously doesn't make any sense. So we've got sort of companion keys here that we're going to use for sorting. And then I've got things like the day name of the week, and then nice versions of the dates. I might want to show January the 2nd of 2005 in that format instead of showing it like this, so I've got display versions of the dates. Now, one other thing up here. If I come up and take a look at some of the calculations to determine the week ending date, well, I'm taking, and most people have probably seen this calculation, I'm taking the original date and I'm determining the day of week by using the date part function. So obviously, on a Sunday to Saturday calendar, a Tuesday is the third day of the week. Well, I'm going to subtract that from 7. And then take that result and add it to the day to come up with the actual week ending date. Now, what some people will do if they want to determine maybe a month into which a date falls, since if we take a look at the calendar here, if we take a look at the end of May, if you're determining a fiscal month, there might be a question as to what June the 1st should fall under. There are more days in that last week of May that belong to May than June. So some people might calculate Friday and Saturday as if the week associated with that month belongs to May because there are more days in that month. Well, in that case, you might subtract not 7 but 4. You might take the Wednesday date and use that as the tiebreaker. So quite a bit of logic here in the view to construct the date dimension. All right, so these are the views that I have established ahead of time. Now, I mentioned there's one here, and I've got it down at the bottom, that we're going to pretend that we don't yet know we need to create. So I'm going to take everything from here on up to the top. And execute this. And I've now got a set of views in AdventureWorks, in the AdventureWorks database in SQL Server. Now, this is in my instance called SQL 2012. We're now going to create a tabular model that's going to use a different instance. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over and launch SQL Server Data Tools. And we're going to stay in there for much of the rest of this demonstration. So I'm going to launch SQL Server Data Tools. And I'm going to create a new tabular project. Notice I've got a set of business intelligence installed templates. I'm going to pick the one called Analysis Services Tabular Project. Now, I'm going to call this ADW SQL 2012 Tabular. I'll just use that name. ADW SQL 2012 Tabular. And take OK. And I'm creating this as a tabular project. Now, in Solution Explorer, all I have is just an empty model right now. Now, the first thing I'm going to do before I go any further is I'm going to rename the model here, because otherwise this is just going to be surfaced to an end user as model. Well, I'll right-click and I'll go into Properties for the model, and I will change the underlying file name from model, and I'll call it, simply call it ADW 2012. So that'll be the name of the model. Well, right now there's nothing in it, and so I need to provide some of those views. So in the drop-down at the top, under Model, I'll take the option Import from Source. Well, I see the different sources that are available here for me. I can pick a source from SQL Server. I can pick it from an Azure database. I can pick it from Parallel Data Warehouse. I can pick it from Access. I've got options if I have information in Teradata or in Sybase or DB2. I can even build a model that comes from another OLAP database. So we have quite a bit of different sources here. Or I could build it from an Excel file or from a text file. Well, I'm going to point to that instance of SQL Server because I want to point to those views. So I'll select Next. Well, it wants to know what the name of the database is, or what the name of the server is. I'll click the drop-down here, and I'll see my standard SQL Server 2012 instance in just a second. It's a second to find the instance. And I'll pick SQL Server 2012. Well, then it wants to know what database, and it's the AdventureWorks 2012 database. I'll take Next. Now, I'll talk about this next week in more detail, but essentially it wants to know when the engine for the tabular model needs to connect back to that source, because we could have it running on a job, what account should be used to authenticate back to the source? Well, I've got the service account set up for everything here on my local machine, so I'm gonna select that. Then it wants to know, do I want to just simply write a query, specify the data to import? Well, there'll be a lot of queries, and plus which we already have views for them, so I'm going to take the first option. Well, then it shows all the tables that are in and the views that are in that database. I'm going to come down to the V section. I'm going to select VDIM customer, VDIM date, VDIM employee, VDIM geography, VDIM product. Now, I had created a promotion dimension before, but I'm keeping it out because I didn't want to add too many dimensions in here. And I'm also keeping out VDIM quarter because, again, we're going to pretend like we don't know about that. And then I'll pick VDIM reseller, and then I'll pick the 3 fact tables: Internet summary, reseller sales summary, and the quota table. So those are the tables I'm going to bring in. Those are the ones that I know about right now. Well, then I'll take finish. Now, if you've ever built a basic star schema database using a basic star schema analytic database using OLAP, using analysis services before, some of these steps probably look a little bit familiar because conceptually they're very similar. Well, what this is doing is it's actually reading in the data from all those views, which obviously go to the underlying tables, and it's also reading data from the fact tables. And that reads them in pretty quickly. Now, these are not large databases. The dimensions are a few hundred rows. The fact tables are 60,000 rows. In a normal environment, that's child's play. But the point is that this could be reading in literally millions of rows or even beyond. Well, that's finished. That read in 9 tables. So I will take close. And what it brings in is a set of tables depicted as tabs here in the model. Well, where do we go from here? Because truthfully, there are a number of different things that we could do. We have to do a little bit of doctoring of the data, and so I'm actually going to start here in the date dimension. Well, in the date dimension, first of all, that month description column, we want to display this, but we want to use the month key for sorting. Well, in the tabular model, and also in Power Pivot 2.0, there's the capability to click on that column and then go up to the top. I'm going to see that we're going to sort by that column. And so I'm going to select sort by column, and it's going to ask what column do I want to use for the sorting. Well, it's going to be the month key. So from that point on, if we ever look at data by month description, it's going to use the underlying month key for the sort. And I'll do the same thing for the quarter key. I'll go to the quarter description, select that column, go up to the top here, tell it to sort by that, tell it to sort by another column, and I'll select quarter key. And now under the hood, anytime we look at data by quarter, it's actually going to sort on the quarter key. And then I'll do one more here. We might want to look at data by the days of the week. Well, by default, this would sort them alphabetically instead of chronologically, and that doesn't make much sense. So I will tell this that the sort key for the English day name of week is going to be the day number of week. Now notice that is actually performing an update to the underlying data, so that does take a few seconds. Now the other thing here is that we've got a number of columns that we might be using under the hood, but they might not be of much value to an end user. For instance, the date key and the full date alternate key and the weekend date might not make much sense because we've got the other columns that we're using for display purposes. So we can actually hide these. I want to do one other thing here before I hide them. The short date and the short weekend date, we're going to do the same thing for the sorting. Because once again, we're actually beginning this with the name of the month. Well, again, we don't want to sort that alphabetically. So for the short date, I'll go to the sort column capability, and I'll say the short date is actually going to be sorted under the hood by the full date alternate key. And the short weekend date, the nice version of the date, is going to be sorted by the weekend date. So you see the pattern here. We in many cases have two sets of columns, one for sorting and one for display. You'll typically see this with a date dimension, more with other dimensions, but truthfully it could happen with any of them. We might have a product dimension where we want to sort the products not alphabetically and maybe not even by the product key. Maybe there's a special menu number order that we use for products. Maybe our top selling product is always at the top of the list. Well, again, we might have an underlying column that drives the sort. All right, well, now that I've got my sort definition set up, I might want to hide some of these. So I can do a click and a shift click from date key out to week ending date, because, again, I might not want to show those to an end user. And then I can right click and I can say hide from client tools. So those aren't going to be shown to the end user. Same thing with the quarter key. I can right click and hide that because I'm going to be displaying the quarter description. And then same thing for the month key. I'll right click on the month key and hide that one. And all the other ones here I'll keep. Actually, the day number of week I truly don't need to display because I've got the English name of the week that's sorting on the day number of week. So I'll hide that one as well. So that's some of the doctrine we might have to do with this date dimension. Now, truthfully, the views could have been constructed a different way that might have resulted in less work or maybe even more work here in this editor. But this is a one and done thing. We won't have to go back and change this unless the underlying definitions dramatically change. All right, well, now I'm going to go to the fact tables. I'm going to go to fact internet sales summary. Well, this is by product, by order date, by customer, and we have a column for number of orders. Well, again, the end user probably doesn't need to see these. They only need to see the aggregations. So I can easily hide these. So I'll right-click on the first three columns, and I'll hide those from end users. Well, I want to aggregate some of the columns here. I want to let users roll up data. Now, to keep from having too many here, I'm going to do it just for one column, but you can obviously see how to work for others. I'm going to take the sales amount, and up in the menu, I'm going to take the option to sum this. Well, that means that the end user is going to be able to roll up sales by any of the related dimensions. Now, the name of the measure winds up being sum of sales amount. Well, in the reseller table, we're going to have a similar column, so I'm going to actually change this up here and call this sum internet sales. You can actually give that for a name. Now, if I wanted to allow people to aggregate other data like tax amount and freight and product cost, I'd aggregate those as well. I'm just, in the interest of time, we're just going to do it for one measure. It's all we need to do it for. Well, then I'm going to go to the reseller data. So I'll go to VFACT reseller data. And once again, I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to hide the keys from the end user. Right-click on the first four columns and hide those from the client tools because the end users, again, don't need to see those. And I'm going to aggregate the sales amount. So I'll click on sales amount, and I'll go up to the tool at the top, and I will say that I want to sum that. Now that once again creates a column called sum of sales amount, and I don't want that name, so I'm going to change that under the hood, and I will call that sum seller sales. And then we're going to do one other thing. The quota table as well has a quota amount. It was by employee and by quarter. Well, I'll hide those from the end user. And then the quota table, the quota column itself, I'll summarize that. And I will just simply call this sum employee quota, because again that's by employee and by quarter. All right, well, what's next? would I be able at the moment to simply slice any measure by any dimension? Well, at the moment, no. The numbers wouldn't make any sense because right now there's no built-in relationships. The views didn't have any relationships to each other, obviously. So what I need to do is I need to change this from a grid over to a diagram. Now, I'm going to zoom this a little bit to try to display as much as possible. So as you can imagine, you usually need a fair amount of screen real estate to do this. And what I want to do is I want to get the fact tables in the middle. I'm going to really zoom this out just long enough to get the fact tables in the middle, and then I'll zoom it back, and I'll zoom it the other way so that you can see this better. So I am moving some tables around so that I have the fact tables more or less in the middle. And then the dimensions I'm going to place in specific areas. The product dimension I'm going to put down here. The reseller and the customer dimension I'm going to put on the side. I'm going to put the geography dimension in the middle. And I'll have the employee and the date dimension more or less at the top. Now there's no exact science to this, but generally the fact tables are in the middle and the dimensions are surrounding on the outside. All right, now let me zoom this out a little bit so it can be a little bit easier to see. And then we'll get to building some of the relationships here. Here we go. All right. Well, first of all, on the product area, well, both reseller sales summary and internet sales summary were tied to the product dimension through product key. So I can draw the other relationship here myself. I can take product key and drag it to the product key in dim product. And that actually creates an underlying relationship. Now, very important, if we had referenced a table that had primary key, foreign key relationships in it, those relationships would come in automatically. We have to build these relationships because we were going off of views that didn't know anything about each other. So we have to build the relationships. Well, I'll take the product key from internet sales and do the same thing. And that creates a relationship from internet sales over to dim product. Well, I'll do the same thing for the column that's in common between the two on the date side. Both of these have a column called order date key that we can use to join to the date key in dim date. So I'm going to move this over a little bit, and I'm going to draw the order date key up into dim date. Now, if you are familiar with AdventureWorks, you know that there are actually three dates. There's order date, due date, and ship date, or order date, due date, delivery date, whatever. We're going to look at role-playing dimensions next week. This designer doesn't support role-playing dimensions directly. We have to write a little bit of code. So we'll see that next week. And then I'll drag the order date key up here as well. Well, I also want to look at both reseller sales data and internet sales data by geography. Now, I have to do a little bit of reference or relationship here because neither one of these has a geography key in it. The reseller side has a reseller dimension, has a reference to a reseller key, where the reseller key in turn is pointing to geography. And over the internet sales side, we have a customer key that we can tie to a customer dimension, where the customer dimension is tied to the geography key. So we get two reference relationships we need to draw here. So I will take the reseller key from resellers table, drag it in the reseller key in dim reseller, and that creates a relationship. And then I'll take the geography key from dim reseller and drag it up to the geography key up in dim geography. That's going to permit someone to be able to slice the reseller sales data by any element in the geography dimension, even though there's no direct relationship between the two. So we basically have a star schema approach here. Well, I'll do the same thing on the internet sales side. I will take the customer key and drag that to the dimension where we have a direct relationship. That's by individual customer. And then once that relationship gets created, I'll now take the geography key from dim customer and drag that in the geography key in dim geography. So the end result of this is that we will be able to take a look at sales through two different sales channels, through the vendor sales channel and through the internet, the customer sales channel, by a dimension that the two fact tables aren't directly related to, because they're related indirectly through two other dimensions. Well, we're going to look at that data in just a minute, but there's one other thing that we want to do. I'm going to open this in Excel in just a minute and make like a power user, but there's one other thing we want to do here. In the geography side, we have the ability to build a hierarchy. Now, truthfully, you can slice and dice data without a hierarchy, but having a hierarchy does make certain operations a lot easier. Well, what I'm going to do here in the geography dimension is I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to create a hierarchy. And by the way, while this is working, we are probably going to go a little bit past 1 o'clock, but no later than about 10 or 15 after 1. I don't want to take up everybody's entire afternoon, but we're probably going to go until about 10 or 15 after 1. Well, I'll call this hierarchy. I'll call it GeoTree. Give it a nice simple name. I'll call it GeoTree. And okay, that's renaming. Some renaming can take a few seconds. Well, this is going to be made up of the English country region name. Now, I'm sticking with the original AdventureWorks names. I didn't shorten these names. Obviously, in an actual environment, you might change this to just plain country. And I'll take the country and drag it down here into the hierarchy area. And then I'll take the state province name, which would be the next level down, and drag that underneath. Sometimes the dragging can be a little tricky here. And wait for that to update. And now we get state province, and now I'll bring in city. I'll go down as far as city. So I will drag city in. So when we browse this in Excel, we'll be able to see, we'll be able to traverse these parent-child relationships. Well, I'll do this for one other dimension. I'll do it for the date dimension, since we built those date levels. I'll right-click on VDIM date, and I will create a hierarchy. And down at the bottom, I'll call this date tree. I'll call it date tree. Now, I will build it just based upon the year, the month, the quarter, and the week ending date. I won't do it for every level. And by the way, I'm going to save this. I'm running a lot of things at once right now, so just to avoid losing anything, I'm going to save this entire project. All right, and then for the hierarchy, well, it'll start with a year. And I want to show all of these columns, so I'm going to move things down a little bit and stretch this. As you can imagine, the better resolution you're running in, the better for you. So this will start with year. And we're going to be browsing this in Excel in just a few minutes here. See the results of our work. And then I'll take the quarter description. Remember, under the hood, that's being sorted by the quarter key, and drag that down underneath the year. And then I'll take the month description and drag the month description down underneath quarter description. And then I'll take the short weekend date. I'll have this date hierarchy just go down as far as the weekend date level. Maybe we don't want to go any further than weekend date. So I'll take the short weekend date and drag that underneath the month description. Let's try that again. Okay, well, I'm ready to look at some data. I'm not finished here, but I'm ready to look at some data. Well, if I go over to the project and if I right-click on the project and go to Properties, notice how the database that's going to get deployed is the same name as the project, ADW SQL 2012 Tabular. Notice the server name. I had set up previously when I installed SQL Server, when I installed the Tabular model, well, that prompted me to create a second instance, which I've called SQL 2012. So if anyone wants to create a report against this data, they'd have to point to that particular instance. That's as opposed to an OLAP instance if we were creating OLAP projects. Well, I will right-click and take the option to deploy. This is doing the equivalent of a process if we were running with an OLAP database. And so that essentially reads the data from the underlying tables that are referenced in the views and generates a tabular model that we can interact with similar to the way that we would interact with an OLAP model using tools like Excel. So that's finished. So we now have out in management, if I were to open up Management Studio and connect to that instance, we now have a living, breathing analytic database called ADW SQL 2012 Tabular. As a matter of fact, if I tab over to Management Studio and I connect to Analysis Services and to my tabular model, I now see in the list of databases the one that we just built that we called ADW SQL 12 Tabular. It's actually out there now. Well, I'm going to look at it in Excel. I want to make like a power user. Now, you might think, oh, I've got to launch Excel and I've got to connect to this database. Well, watch this capability. This is a new feature that I really like. In the drop-down under Model, there's the ability to analyze in Excel. Watch what this does. First of all, it'll allow me to launch this database and look at it in Excel, either using the current Windows user or to impersonate another user, and also to test out a role. I'll show the role in a minute. I'm going to use the default perspective. So I'll click OK. And that actually launches behind the scenes Excel, and it is built the structure for a pivot table for us with the connection string already set. So I didn't need to launch Excel. I didn't need to connect. It did it for me. Well, I'll bring in the sum of internet sales, and that's 29 million. And I'll bring in the sum of reseller sales, and that's 80 million. That's rolling up the data in the same way that an OLAP cube would, because remember, we set up those two aggregations to sum the data. Well, let me come down now to the geography dimension. And notice how we have the geotree hierarchy. I'm going to take that and drag that into the row label quadrant at the bottom. Look familiar? It's almost the same way. Actually, it's identical to what an end user would get if they were going against an OLAP cube. So I can expand Canada, and I get the internet sales and the reseller sales by state, province, or by individual city underneath. And so I see in some instances I've got data just for one sales channel and not the other. Then I could go to the date hierarchy, and I'll put that date tree up in the report filter quadrant. Well, maybe I want to look at this just for 2007. Well, the numbers drop down as a result. That's because both of those were tied to the date dimension. We're getting the exact same effect that we would get if we were going against OLAP. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to do it here today, but I could open up bids and I could create a reporting services report and go against this tabular model in the same way that we could go against an OLAP database. So now we start to see what Microsoft means by the business intelligence semantic model. Well, I can also look at this by product. Now, I didn't build a product hierarchy, but I can still go down to dim product and take a look at things by the English product category name. So I'll put that in the filter as well. I'll click the drop down here, and for the English product category name, I'll select clothing. Well, numbers go down a lot since most AdventureWorks data is for bikes. So that's one way that we can slice and dice data. Now let's look at some other things that we can do in here. Again, this is definitely, we're going to look at some of the more advanced features next week, but certainly want to see some of the other things we can do in here. Suppose we had users who could only see clothing and nothing else. Or users who could only see mountain bikes or touring bikes. We actually have a subcategory for touring bikes. If I get rid of, or if I come down to the product dimension, there's a separate attribute here for subcategory. And we have people look at just mountain bikes or touring bikes or road bikes or whatever. Well, let me close Excel here. And back in the designer, we have the ability to build a role. So I'll construct a role. I'll create a new role here. Now I have to give it a name, and I'll call it, I'll make this very simple. I'll call it role for bikes. And this is going to be a role where someone can just read data and that's it. And I can give it a description. It's obviously just sales for bikes only. Then we come down to the corresponding dimension. And I'm going to put in an expression. And I can come down, I get IntelliSense here to discover the different attributes, and I'll come down to vdim product and go down to the English product category name, and I'll say that is equal to, and then in quotes, bikes. So this role is going to be associated just with the category bikes. Now over in the other tab, there's a members tab, and I can define what users or what groups of users are going to be associated with this role. Now I'm running on a domain where right now it's just me and all the other system users, so I'm just going to pick a dummy user here. It really doesn't matter which one, because I'm going to test the role, not the user. So I'll take the backup operator because it really doesn't matter here. I'm not interested in testing for a person at the moment. I'm going to test the role. So with this role set up, I'll click OK. And I will right-click and redeploy to push that role into the database. And then I'm going to open up Excel again, and I'm going to use Excel to test the role. So that ability to test something out in Excel is very, very cool. So once again, for the model drop-down, I'm going to go down and analyze in Excel, but this time I'm going to test using the role for bikes. And then click OK. And if I go over to Excel, and I bring in the sum of internet sales, well, right now I know right away that something is different because normally the sales across all of AdventureWorks is 29 million. Now it's 28. And the reseller sales is normally 80 million. Now it's 66. So I know that something is up. Well, if I go down to the product dimension and I take the English product category name and put that in the rows, the only one I see here is bikes. And if I, for that matter, if I go to the subcategory, the only subcategories I see here are the ones for bikes. So there's that role in action. So we can test that role out very, very easily. Okay, well, we've looked at the ability to view sales by two different sales channels. Now I'm going to start looking at data by quota. Well, I intentionally didn't do anything with this reseller sales quota table, and I didn't do anything with the employee dimension as well. Well, we want to look at reseller sales versus the quota. We're going to have a little bit of a problem here. Well, first of all, I'm going to take the employee key from the reseller's sales summary and drag that up to the employee key in dim employee to set up the relationship there, so I can look at sales by salesman. And then I'll take the corresponding employee key from the quota table, which is right here, and drag that up to the employee dimension as well. Now, someone could obviously move these table diagrams around and make them look a little bit more appealing, and certainly make them a little bit easier to read. Well, now I need to associate that reseller sales quota table with time, because I want to look at sales for an employee and their quota for a particular quarter. Well, my first inclination, it might be to go to the date dimension and take quarter key and drag it up there. Well, we're going to have a problem. Quarter key is not unique in dim date, and so we can't use dim date as the target there. If I go back to Management Studio, this is a key concept, because in many businesses you're going to have multiple fact tables at different levels of granularity, where some of them are going to require some kind of a rolled-up mini dimension. I've created here a subset dimension called vdim quarter that's going to be distinct by year and quarter key and quarter description. So I'm building a little mini dimension here called vdim quarter, which I actually already have here in the database. Well, I didn't include that in my list of tables. How do I get a table into here? Well, there's no capability to click a drop down and say, essentially, add table that you didn't previously add. But we can still get it in here. Here's what we do. If I go back and I take a look at the existing connections, well, we've got one connection in here. Let me go edit it. We've got one connection in here that pointed to SQL 2012 and do AdventureWorks DW 2012 as the database. We had the one connection. If I go edit that, I'm sorry, if I go open it, get my options straight here, and click next, and then scroll down, well, I see vdim quarter in here. Check that on and take finish. And that's going to bring in that mini dimension. This is basically a roll-up of dim date by quarter. Now, in the full-blown version of analysis services with OLAP, it actually isn't necessary to do this. There's a slightly easier way in the full-blown version of OLAP to do this. We have to create a mini dimension here. Well, now vdim quarter is going to be in here. Now, it might be hiding. Come back to the grid. Okay, here it is. Here's vdim quarter. Now I'm going to do the same thing as before. I'm going to take the quarter description here and set up the sort rule where that's going to sort by the quarter key. And then I'm going to go back to the diagram, and somewhere in here, should be VDIM quarter. For whatever reason, I'm actually not seeing it. And I've done this many, many times, and unfortunately, the one time doing this here live, it's not actually displaying. And we only have one. For some reason, that is not displaying, so I'm going to close everything here and reopen it. This might just be a refresh issue. Well, it's definitely participating as a table here on the list. Now let me go back to the diagram. And hopefully we should see it now. Okay, maybe it was out there to begin with. I wasn't seeing it, but it's out there now. So let me bring this up. Now, VDIM quarter, I can now go to the quota table, take the quarter key, and drag that to quarter key here, because the quarter key in VDIM quarter is unique. And now I'm going to take the quarter key from dim date and drag that here as well, because I might want to look at sales for resellers by date that roll up to the quarter. So I'm going to drag the quarter key for VDIM date over to VDIM quarter as well. So a little bit of elbow grease we have to apply here. Well, that's now going to allow me to look at reseller sales summary by employee and by quarter, along with reseller quota by employee and by quarter. So I will save this, and I will redeploy. And now we're going to look at data for a different perspective here. We're going to look at it just by employee and by quarter to take a look at the sales quota along with the person's actual sales. And then we're going to build a KPI, and that'll be it for the day. So looking to finish at about 1:15 here. So I appreciate everybody hanging around. Give this a second to finish. All right, well, now I'll analyze this in Excel. So I'll take close, and once again, I think I closed Excel before. Let me reanalyze this in Excel, and I'm going to go back to just looking at all the data. I'm not going to look at it for a roll. Well, over in Excel, I'm going to display the sum of the reseller data with respect to the quota. Now, across all of time, the reseller sales data has been 80 million. And across all of time, the quota has been 95 million. Well, that's somewhat important to know, but it's better to be able to break it out by the different dimensions. Well, I'll come down to VDIM employee, and I'll take the employee full name and put that in the row label quadrant. Now we have the breakout of every salesperson, what they've sold through the reseller channel, what their quota was. So we see Linda Mitchell here. Across all of time, her quota has been 11 million, and she sold 10 million. As a matter of fact, everybody is below the quota. These quotas are most people are below the quotas. These quotas are set sort of high. Well, let me go down to that little mini dimension called VDIM quarter, and let me put the quota description in the filter area. And let's look at this for one time period. I'll cut it for maybe quarter 3 of 06. But watch, the numbers are going to go down further still. So Linda sold 1 million for quarter 3, and her quota was 1.3 million. Well, we want to construct a KPI to visually show someone's performance with respect to their quota. Now, this particular KPI, we're going to say that if someone was at 80% of their quota, that's good. If they were between 70 and 80, that's okay. And if they weren't at least 70% of their quota, well, that's not good. And so, I'm going to come back to the project here, and this is the last thing that we'll do for today. I'm going to go back to the data. Now, where you put the KPI in, sometimes people have a little bit of trouble when they look at the tabular model for the first time on where to put the KPI in. Well, it's important to remember what measure we're analyzing. We have to implement a KPI with respect to the measure that we're analyzing. We're analyzing the sum of sales compared to the quota. So the measure itself we're analyzing is the sum of sales. So I will go to the factory reseller sales summary. And for the sum of sales, down at the bottom here, I'm going to right-click for the sum of reseller sales, and I'm going to create a KPI. Now, if you build KPIs using analysis services, you know that you write them using MDX. KPIs in the tabular model, you don't have quite as much capability out of the box, but you do get a little bit easier interface for creating basic KPIs. Well, I want to compare the sum of reseller sales to the sum of the quota. So I'm comparing one sum to the other. Well, down at the bottom here, I can slide the scale here based upon what I consider to be good or not. Well, 80 was actually the default here, so anything that's 80 and above is good. Anything between 70 and 80 is okay, and anything below 70 is not good. Now, you've got different options down here. You can use the racing flag symbols. You can use the red X versus the check mark. There are different options you have in here. Well, I'll stay with the default options here and click OK. That's actually it to create a KPI. Well, I'll right-click and I'll redeploy this. And then I'll come back to the same Excel spreadsheet. Now, the Excel spreadsheet doesn't know about the KPI because I just created the KPI. So I'm going to do a refresh here in just a moment. So that's been deployed. Well, I'll come back to Excel. Now, there's no KPI in this list here. There's no KPI in the pivot table field list. Well, here's what we do. If I simply click on the options drop-down in Excel and take refresh all, that refreshes the pivot table field list, and now I have a KPI. Well, a KPI has a couple of components to it. The value, which is the sum of the reseller sales, which we're already showing. The goal is the quota, which I'm already showing. Well, I'll show the status. And there we actually get the visualization. So Pamela here sold above her quota. She sold 329. Her quota was 210. So that's obviously good. Amy here was supposed to sell 93. She sold 73. Oh, that's somewhere between 70 and 80%. So that's an okay or a warning. And this particular person, Jay Pack, was supposed to sell 1.8 million and sold 800,000. So that's below. Now, the next thing you might be asking is where's the percent? Well, to implement the percent, we have to write a little bit of DAX code. In this case, it's not going to be much. I'm actually going to save that for next week because I intentionally wanted to keep DAX out of the mix for this week. But we do have to incorporate some DAX code for even sometimes basic calculations. Now, basic DAX expressions are not too bad. More complicated DAX expressions that we'll look at, they involve writing some code that looks, for all intents and purposes, looks almost as complicated as MDX, but still can be very powerful. So, this is our first look at the tabular model in analysis services. Now, there was one thing I wanted to cover this week. I'm just going to speak to it briefly because I don't want to take much more time here. But back in the project, there is the ability, and I'll save this for next week, there's the ability to build partitions. Let's say if this fact table got very, very large and we wanted to maybe break it up by partitions, maybe one for active years and one for archive years. We can actually click on the partition button up here at the top, Now we can actually, instead of having the default partition occupy the entire table, we can instead actually write a SQL query and change this from using the entire table to using part of the table. And we'd have to actually put in some type of a select statement that would filter based upon the date, where we might join this order date key to dim date to do it just for the years, maybe 2006 and before for an archive partition, and then another one for an active partition. So what we would wind up doing is editing this to change the name, and then actually implementing a SQL query, and then adding a second partition where we once again would go in and change this from a table to actually putting in a SQL query to grabbing the data from that's greater than 2006. We'll take a look at that next week. I don't want to get too deep into anything right now, so we'll take a look at that next week. So that is our first look at creating a tabular model. A few intricacies we had to deal with, primarily anytime we have a relationship that's other than a basic star scheme approach. We had introduced a mini dimension because we had one fact table at the date level and the other at the quarter level, and we wanted to compare measures from two fact tables were built on those two different date levels. So a little bit of work that we have to do in the relationship area, but overall, this was less work than what we would have to do if we use the full-blown OLAP model in analysis services. Now, I personally love OLAP. I think OLAP is fantastic, and I would probably, because it's what I'm most familiar with, I would probably build this as an OLAP project, but that's only because I've been using OLAP for years. A lot of people that aren't as fortunate or don't have the time to go through the learning curve, or they know it just as well. Well, the tabular model presents a somewhat simpler way to create an analytic database that end users can slice and dice against the same way that they could do against an OLAP queue. Now, next week, I'm going to look at a little bit more advanced project. Now, I'm not going to spend as much time looking at the data next week as I want to get into the advanced project a little bit more in depth. So next week, we're going to look at advanced project where we've got more relationships that are not direct. And we're going to look at partitions, and we're also going to look at a few DAX formulas. So hopefully this has been helpful for everybody as a first look at what we can do. Let me come back to the slide deck here real quick. And come take a look at the schedule. So I'm going to come back to the slide deck. And again, this week we took a look at a basic example of this tabular model. Next week, we're going to look at a more advanced example with a little bit of DAX code, some more advanced relationships, and going to look at partitions and a few other things I didn't show this week. And then down the line, when we get into DAX 2.0 and we get into Power View, we're going to look at some new capabilities for looking at data in that tabular model that didn't exist prior to SQL Server 2012. But the point to remember is that tabular model can be viewed by a lot of tools right now. Again, I could go into reporting services. I could go into other tools that previously could browse OLAP data and browse that tabular model just as easily. So we'll get into some more advanced capabilities next week. Again, the information for this webinar is up on my website. It's just kevinsgoff.net. I actually have a separate category for Microsoft Webcast. If I actually go back out to my desktop here and take a look at my website, again, if you go to kevinsgoff.net, I've got a separate category here for Microsoft Webcast and a little bit of coverage and some information on downloads and registration links for subsequent weeks. So just go to kevinsgoff.net for more information, and again, it's in the Microsoft Webcast area. So that's a wrap for this week. So thank you all for attending, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email address here in the slide deck is kgoff@kevinsgoff.net. So feel free to drop me an email. And otherwise, see you next week, same time, same station, and we'll get into part 2 of the tabular model. So thanks everybody for coming, and have a good weekend, and hope to see you all here next Friday. So long.